For 30 years, if you ran a company or a government office almost anywhere on Earth, you paid Microsoft. Every single computer, every single year, a quiet, guaranteed fee baked into the cost of doing business, whether you liked it or not. In 2026, China stopped paying it. Not with a speech, not with a boycott, with a product. Huawei has been rolling out desktop computers and laptops that run zero American software top to bottom. No Windows, no Intel, or AMD chip inside. The operating system is called HarmonyOS Next, built entirely in-house. The processor is called Kirin, also built entirely in-house. And the target buyer isn't hobbyists or tech geeks looking for a novelty. It's government offices, banks, and state-run companies, the exact customers who used to write Microsoft the biggest checks every single year. Here's the part that doesn't make it into most headlines. This didn't happen overnight in some panic move. Chinese officials had already ordered government agencies to phase out foreign chips and foreign operating systems, with state-owned enterprises given until 2027 to finish the switch. What changed in 2026 is that Huawei finally had a real desktop machine ready to plug into that order. The policy existed for years. The hardware just caught up. So what happens to a business model built on the assumption that everyone, everywhere, eventually has to pay the toll? For 3 decades, Windows sat in the middle of almost every office on the planet like a toll booth nobody could drive around. Now, the biggest market in Asia just built its own road. That is not a small story about one country's tech preference. That is a crack in one of the most reliable revenue machines American business has ever built. And once you see how deep that crack runs, you'll understand why boardrooms in Redmond, Santa Clara, and Austin have been watching Xinjiang's neighbor to the east a lot more closely than they're letting on. It also helps to remember who is building this. Huawei is the same company that got cut off from American chip supplies back in 2019, blacklisted, and told it would never again get access to the cutting-edge technology it needed to compete. Most analysts at the time figured that was the end of Huawei as a serious hardware player. Instead, the company spent the next 7 years quietly building everything it used to buy from someone else. The operating system, the chip. Now the finished computer. That's not a company reacting to a ban, that's a company that used the ban as a deadline. Let's talk about what that toll booth was actually worth, because the number is bigger than most people realize. For decades, the deal was simple. You buy a computer. Somewhere in that price, whether you saw the line item or not, a chunk of it went to Microsoft for the right to run Windows. And often another chunk went to Intel or AMD for the chip inside. Multiply that by hundreds of millions of machines sold every single year in every country on Earth. In real terms, that's less like selling a product and more like owning the electricity meter on every house in the neighborhood. You don't have to sell anyone anything new. You just get paid every time the lights turn on. China matters here in a way that's easy to underestimate. It isn't just one customer. It's the largest PC market on the planet. And it's also home to some of the biggest chip makers now getting cut out entirely. Intel pulled in roughly a quarter of its entire global revenue from China. AMD wasn't far behind, pulling in close to 15% of its sales from the same market. Microsoft's direct cut of Chinese government revenue was always smaller by comparison, but that was never really the point. The point was always which direction the rest of the world would follow. Think about the sheer number of machines involved here, too. China's government and its state-owned companies run millions of desktop computers across ministries, banks, hospitals, and utilities. Every single one of those machines was, until very recently, a small but guaranteed line of income for a handful of American companies. Picture a landlord who owns the only apartment building in town, watching every tenant move out on the same afternoon into houses they built themselves on land they already owned. If you are into stories about technology changing the world in ways nobody expected, hit that like button and subscribe. Because this isn't just a story about China buying fewer American products, it's a story about China building the exact playbook that dozens of other countries have been quietly hoping someone would hand them. Think about what that means for everyone else watching. Governments across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America have spent years complaining, mostly in private, about being locked into American software they can't fully inspect, can't fully control, and can't stop paying for. China just proved you can walk away from that lock, chip, and operating system both, and still run a functioning government office on top of it. So what do you do when the country holding a quarter of your chip sales and the single largest PC market on the planet decides it doesn't need you anymore? You watch very closely to see if anyone else follows. And to understand why other countries might actually follow, you need to go back and see exactly how China built its way out in the first place. This didn't start with a desktop computer. It started with a decision made years earlier that most people outside the industry never noticed. Back in 2022 and 2023, Chinese regulators quietly began drafting new procurement rules. Government agencies above a certain size, along with state-owned companies, would eventually be required to use hardware and software labeled safe and reliable. In plain terms, that meant domestic. No foreign chips, no foreign operating systems. The rule gave everyone a runway, with a hard deadline set for 2027. Here's the problem China ran into almost immediately. You can write a rule banning foreign technology in an afternoon. Building a replacement that people can actually use, one that runs the banking software, the tax systems, and the office tools an entire government depends on, takes years. So Huawei went to work on two fronts at once, and this is the part worth understanding because it explains why this took so long to show up in a finished product. On one front, the company kept expanding HarmonyOS, the operating system it originally built for phones, teaching it to run laptops instead. The first HarmonyOS laptop landed in 2025. On the other front, Huawei's chip division kept refining its own processor line called Kirin, pushing it from phone-sized chips towards something powerful enough to run a full desktop computer without slowing down. By April 2026, those two tracks met. Huawei launched the MateBook 14, its first mainstream laptop running entirely on an in-house Kirin chip, and HarmonyOS Next, with zero Intel, zero AMD, and zero Windows anywhere inside it. A few months later, at Huawei's own developer conference, the company showed off something bigger, a desktop tower built specifically for offices, banks, and government buildings, aimed squarely at replacing the exact machines those buyers had been renting Windows licenses for since the 1990s. Notice the order things happened in. Laptop first, aimed at everyday consumers who could shrug off the occasional missing app. Desktop second, aimed at the government and enterprise buyers who cannot shrug off a missing app, because that missing app might be the software running their payroll or their tax filings. That sequence wasn't an accident. It was a company testing its own product on a forgiving audience before betting it on an unforgiving one. That desktop is expected to start shipping commercially by September 2026 after a summer trial run inside real Chinese offices. Not a lab demo, not a trade show mock-up, a working machine, headed straight for the desks of the customers the 2027 deadline was written for. So this wasn't a sudden eviction. It was a 4-year construction project hidden behind a procurement memo most people never read that finally produced a computer capable of doing the job. And now that the hardware exists, the real question becomes obvious. How do you actually build a machine that replaces 3 decades of American technology without the whole thing falling apart the moment you turn it on? That's where the engineering gets interesting. Start with the easiest problem to picture, but one of the hardest to actually solve: the processor. For 30 years, almost every serious desktop computer on Earth ran on a chip designed either by Intel or by AMD. Those two companies didn't just sell hardware, they controlled the entire instruction set, the basic language every piece of software on that computer had to speak to get anything done. Cutting them out doesn't just mean unplugging a part, it means designing your own brain for the machine, one that speaks a completely different language from the one every app in the world was written for. Huawei's answer is the Kirin chip. Originally built for phones, Kirin speaks a different chip language, one based on the same family used in most smartphones rather than the traditional PC family Intel, and AMD built their empire on, scaling that phone-style design up to handle a full desktop workload, running spreadsheets, databases, and video calls all day without overheating or slowing to a crawl. is a genuinely hard engineering problem. Think of it like taking a nimble scooter engine and rebuilding it, piece by piece, until it can reliably tow a delivery truck. The chip reportedly powering Huawei's new enterprise desktop is called the Kirin X90, an 8-core design running around 2.5 gigahertz, paired with fast quad-channel memory to keep data moving in and out quickly enough for real office work. None of that matters if you can't get software to run on it, which brings us to the second, much bigger problem. Worth pausing on why this matters beyond one company's spec sheet. Building your own competitive chip means you are no longer waiting in line behind everyone else for the newest factory time, the newest export license, or the newest trade rule out of Washington. Every year, Huawei's chip division closes the performance gap with Intel, and AMD is a year China's government buyers no longer have to weigh national security against raw computing power. That trade-off used to be real. It is getting smaller with every generation of Kirin that ships. There's a trap that has killed every previous attempt to replace Windows. Even if your chip works perfectly, none of the world's existing software was ever built to run on it. So every piece of business software on Earth, your accounting program, your banking system, your office suite, was written assuming an Intel or AMD chip underneath and Windows sitting on top. Swap either one out, and by default, none of that old software runs. It's like handing someone a filing cabinet built for European paper sizes and asking them to instantly file American documents in it. The drawers exist, the folders just don't fit. Huawei's solution came in two parts. First, HarmonyOS. Next includes a compatibility layer, a kind of built-in translator, letting a slice of older Windows-style applications run without being fully rewritten. Second, and far more important long-term, Huawei pushed hard to get China's biggest software makers, its banks, its state software vendors, its office tool developers, to build fresh, native versions of their programs, specifically for HarmonyOS. That second part is the unglamorous, grinding work nobody puts in a highlight reel. It's not one dramatic breakthrough, it's thousands of individual companies, one at a time, rebuilding software that already worked fine on Windows just so it can run on something else instead. That's a number worth sitting with, because it shows how big that grind actually was. By the time Huawei's enterprise desktop was ready to leave the lab, HarmonyOS had already reached hundreds of millions of active devices across phones, tablets, and laptops in China, giving software makers a customer base too large to keep ignoring. That's the quiet leverage behind the whole switch. Nobody had to force banks and state software vendors to rebuild their programs at gunpoint. They rebuilt because hundreds of millions of paying users were already sitting on the other side of that decision. Waiting. Which leads to the oldest problem in computing, the one that has quietly killed almost every rival operating system for the last 40 years, the chicken and the egg. Nobody wants to buy a computer with no software available for it, but no software company wants to spend money building for a computer nobody owns yet. This exact trap killed Windows Phone. It nearly killed early Android. It is the single biggest reason Windows has stayed on top of the desktop world for 3 straight decades, long after plenty of technically better options existed. China's answer wasn't clever, it was blunt. Instead of waiting for the market to slowly decide HarmonyOS was worth building for, the government simply became the first customer, at massive scale, on a fixed deadline. When every ministry, every state bank, and every government-linked company knows they must switch by 2027, software vendors don't have to guess whether building for HarmonyOS is worth it. The buyer is already guaranteed. The order book already exists before the product even ships. In real terms, it's like a city announcing every public bus will run on a new type of fuel starting in 3 years. Fuel station owners don't debate whether to install the new pumps. They already know exactly how many buses are coming and exactly when. That's the advantage no Western challenger to Windows has ever had: a guaranteed customer at national scale with a deadline attached. Here's where this stops being a story about one country's computers and becomes something much bigger. The real damage to Microsoft was never going to come from China's direct payments drying up. Microsoft's own government revenue from China was always a small slice of its global business, nowhere close to the money at stake for Intel or AMD. That's the detail almost every headline gets backwards. The actual threat is something quieter and far more dangerous long-term: the playbook itself. China just proved in public in a finished commercial product that a government can walk away from decades of foreign software dependence, chip and operating system both, on a fixed timeline without collapsing its own computing systems in the process. Let that sink in. For 30 years, the entire argument for staying on Windows in poorer or mid-sized countries was simple. There is no real alternative. Building your own operating system and your own chip from scratch is too expensive, too risky, and takes too long for any government to actually pull off. China just spent 4 public years disproving that argument and shipped the receipt in the form of an actual desktop computer sitting on actual desks. So picture the government IT ministry in a country in Southeast Asia or Africa or Latin America, one that has spent years quietly frustrated with foreign licensing fees it can't renegotiate and software it can't fully inspect for its own security reasons. That ministry no longer has to build its own chip from zero or write its own operating system from a blank page. It can license, adapt, or simply copy the structure China already proved works. Government demand first, guaranteed at scale, software vendors following right behind it. That is the actual export product here. Not a laptop, not a desktop tower, a working blueprint for how any government can walk away from the Windows tax, the same tax the rest of the world has been quietly paying since the early 1990s. And Huawei already has the sales relationships to move that blueprint fast. This is a company that has spent years selling telecom towers, 5G networks, and phones across Africa, Southeast Asia, and Latin America, building government relationships most Silicon Valley firms never bothered to build. It doesn't need to convince those governments that Huawei is a serious partner. That trust was laid years ago, one telecom contract at a time. All it has to convince them of now is that the computer sitting on the desk works just as well as the network sitting in the ground. Not a rumor, not a prototype stuck in a lab, a shipped, working demonstration sitting on desks in Chinese government buildings right now. So who actually takes the hit here? Let's be specific, because the tech industry doesn't mean anything on its own. Start with Intel. China was its single largest national market, worth more than a quarter of the company's entire global revenue. Intel has already been fighting shrinking margins and a punishing chip war with AMD and NVIDIA, losing meaningful ground in its biggest market, right as it's spending billions trying to rebuild its manufacturing edge, is exactly the kind of hit a company in Intel's position can least afford. Then there's AMD pulling close to 15% of its own sales from China, a market it fought hard for years to win away from Intel in the first place. Watching that market get walked back by a domestic Chinese chip instead means AMD spent a decade winning a fight that a government policy just quietly ended. And then there's Microsoft itself. Its direct China revenue was never the biggest number on this list, but Microsoft's entire global business model depends on one core assumption: that switching away from Windows is too expensive and too risky for any large organization to seriously attempt. China just spent 4 years and one finished desktop computer, proving that assumption wrong in public, for anyone else watching to copy. Here's the part that should worry all 3 of those companies more than any single quarter's earnings report. This was never really about losing China as a customer. China was always going to be a smaller and smaller slice of the pie as its own industry matured. It's about every other government now watching, taking notes, and realizing the toll booth everyone assumed was permanent just got built around, in plain sight, on a fixed schedule, by a company most of them had never even considered a software company 5 years ago. Picture the next decade playing out from here. A handful of mid-sized economies quietly start running trial programs of their own, using Huawei's playbook or copying it outright with local engineers. None of them individually dent Microsoft's stock price. But add them up over 10 years, one government ministry at a time, and you get something that looks a lot less like a rounding error and a lot more like the slow leak that eventually sinks a business built entirely on the assumption that nobody would ever find another way in. So here's the question worth sitting with. If China can build a working, government-scale replacement for Windows, Intel, and AMD in under 4 years, and hand the rest of the world a working blueprint for doing the same, how many more countries need to try it before the 30-year toll booth Microsoft has been collecting on stops being the safe, guaranteed bet Wall Street has always assumed it would be?